What done diddly killed deathcore, and what saved deathcore? Compared to a lot of different metal subgenres, deathcore has always been one of the weirdest to examine because it's went through so many different evolutionary periods throughout its fairly short timeline. I mean, obviously it was in its infancy in like the early 2000s, but when you compare it to things like black metal and death metal and grindcore, it's still a pretty young genre. And believe it or not, a time not too terribly long ago in the grand scheme of things, there was a time when deathcore didn't only have its own place at the musical discussion table, but was one of the most domineering presences that were there in the first place. Culturally, as well as fashion-wise, this genre was causing so much disagreement, polarization, debate, controversy, whole video essays about whether or not it was metal or not, if it should even be considered music, that it was degenerative, all of its ties that it had to scene culture with bands like Bring Me the Horizon, and how so many of the bands overlapped with the scene metalcore MySpace era that was booming in the late 2000s going into the early 2010s. But alongside that, you also had a lot of other deathcore bands that were dominating the tempo that weren't necessarily just these sceney bopper sort of deathcore bands, the Whitechapels, the Thy Art Is Murders. But then something changed. The most popular names in deathcore started to fall off. There was a drastic decline in the interest that people showed with that genre. And you can chalk this up to, oh, people just got sick of it. People wanted something new. People wanted something fresh and unique, which you can't really blame them. People are always clamoring for the newest trend to hop on top of. And obviously the 2010s were no stranger to different metal movements and micro-genres. I mean, you had things like black gaze getting its boom, you had things like new metalcore coming around, and a ton of hybrid genres that were starting to dominate the ethosphere of coverage from publications and reviewers. And the bands that were getting the most acclaim were not necessarily just the cookie-cutter true blue approach to any given genre, as experimentation sort of became the name of the game. So many of the bands that were the most popular of the genre slowly but surely started to change their style, deviate, and I'm not even just talking about changing the formula of deathcore, I'm talking about going against it entirely and doing something else, with Job for a Cowboy becoming more of a death metal band, with Bring Me the Horizon turning into a metalcore and a later alternative rock and alternative metal band, within the Ruins starting to incorporate more instrumentation that was akin to metalcore music, incorporating clean vocals, as well as bands like Whitechapel slowly but surely incorporating clean vocals, and their album The Valley boosting that in and of itself. And one thing I want to get out of the way is, I understand that throughout these times there were probably fantastic deathcore releases that dropped during that period of lack of interest in the genre, and the bands that were still deathcore and creating great music in the genre, I have no doubt they were doing incredible numbers, but those are the people that were already predisposed to listen to that music in the first place. Deathcore was not really bringing in that many new listeners. Most of the people that were diehard fans of those bands were gonna stay diehard fans of those bands. And while people that were already so entrenched and down the rabbit hole of deathcore would know a new great deathcore release from some underground band, a lot of metalheads that weren't already in that space weren't going to suddenly snap their neck around and understand that a new great deathcore album released unless it just got a ton of acclaim. And as someone who very, very closely followed and made content in the 2010s dedicated to metal, I was not seeing that many deathcore albums that were dominating the conversation whatsoever. And then you stack on top of that some of the hallmark bands just sort of souring over time, with Suicide Silence drawing a lot of shit for their self-titled album, people not really liking Eddie as a vocalist in general, and bands like Thy Art Is Murder being fine, but playing by the numbers. And you could say that about a project like Chelsea Grin as well. And even one of my favorite bands, Carnifex, generally speaking, played by the numbers and didn't release that much music. And even more so, Born of Osiris and Veil of Maya, two of the titans of deathcore and tech deathcore, completely changed their style to metalcore over time. So I do think a big reason that deathcore had its fall from grace wasn't necessarily that there wasn't any good deathcore being released. I think it's just the diverging point where a lot of the biggest names that could have kept the standard up and standard bared for the genre as a whole started to go by the wayside because they changed their style and started to gain new listeners for that specific style. And even if people listened to their back catalog, they weren't going to get a good approximation of where they stood today. And it got so bad that even a project like a super group from Umber Vitae, I forget the name of that album, but it came out in the early 2020s, it was like an all-star group of deathcore people and just seemed to be a flash in the pan. People did not care after it came out. They listened to it for a week and then stopped fucking talking about it entirely. Like, let's be honest here, unless you're just a sycophant for deathcore, who is bringing up Umber Vitae in conversations nowadays? But something changed in the modern era, and deathcore is not only back on the map, but once again one of the biggest metal subgenres currently. How did that happen and why? And I can split this up into a couple of things. The first thing I will say is, while it can be a very bad thing, I think the loudness war was very beneficial to deathcore sort of getting a boost. Reaction channels and streamers and stuff were pushed to react to different deathcore music that had the heaviest breakdown possible, that was a skyscraper, that had the loudest mix you've ever heard in your life, compressed to all hell. And that generated clicks, that generated people wanting to make more reactions to it, and when it came to content creation, a lot of these bands started to get boosted up because people would react to them. I'm talking about projects like Worm Shepherd, I'm talking projects like Jaluka to some degree, I'm talking projects like Infant Annihilator back in the day when they burst on the scene. And even some like slam deathcore projects like Within Destruction, Signs of the Swarm sort of benefited from that as well, but there were a couple of names that would dominate deathcore and still are dominating deathcore, namely Lorna Shore and Slaughter to Prevail. Alex Terrible had already built up a repertoire of doing his silly covers of like pop songs but making them metal, and he's just a very charismatic dude to a lot of people. Even if I don't agree with a lot of his opinions nowadays, he clearly had like this cult of personality built up around him. And then you look at Lorna Shore, I mean, what do you even have to say there? Will Ramos is like one of the most charismatic and well-acclaimed frontmen of any metal band of the past couple of decades. There are very few faces and names in terms of the people that get covered and interviewed and talked about as him, and you can chalk that up to maybe just him being very active from social media perspective and how much power and influence that has nowadays, but he's just a great dude. And Lorna Shore changed the game in many ways, and that kind of moves me on to my next point. Deathcore was not afraid to experiment anymore, and then you started to see this like trend of symphonic blackened deathcore start to dominate it, where every band that was popular in the deathcore space seemed to kind of play by the same rule book when it came to incorporating these black metal intermissions and general blast beats that sounded very black metal and different vocalizations. And so combined with the oh my god moment of these larger than life breakdowns, it kind of was the perfect formula to get people intrigued and excited again. And that is what keeps a genre alive, is some form of excitement that gets both new listeners into the fold as well as old listeners excited. And that is a very, very tightrope to walk, because obviously if you're changing up your style, not everyone is going to like it. And there genuinely are people that don't like bands like Lorna Shore, Slaughter to Prevail, because they don't feel like early deathcore so much anymore. They feel like they're taking it out of their comfort zone, and so they don't like the change and adaptation of the modern era of deathcore. So you're not going to be able to please anyone, but a very important thing is simultaneously being able to toe the line between the appeal of your genre and keeping up with the hallmarks that old people fell in love with your band to begin with, or fell in love with the musical style as a whole to begin with, and alternatively getting new listeners into the genre to expand it and get the discussion flowing even more. And that's kind of the era we are in with deathcore, where deathcore, similar to metalcore, is very broad. It is hard as hell to define when you got bands like Whitechapel that have fully clean vocal albums, but they're still deathcore. You look at a band like Within the Ruins, they're still deathcore. You look at a band like Lorna Shore and Slaughter to Prevail, they're deathcore. Those four bands are pretty much nothing alike. They may have some similarities in how they approach things, but they're astronomically different, and I think that's beautiful. I think that's awesome. I think that's how a lot of genres should be, and I think that's why a genre like metalcore has had such longevity and success and a constant stay at the table when it comes to discussion in the metal world. So I think that the combination of social media presence as well as going outside of the comfort zone, and bands even like Infant Annihilator back in the day started to kind of drum up the intrigue because they had a lot of that blackened influence, and you could see how in the mid to late 2010s they started to drum up a lot of intrigue for the genre. And I've went on the record saying Infant Annihilator is like one of the most important bands when it comes to deathcore, and I think saved it from the brink of fucking disaster and falling off the map entirely. I think they're incredibly important to the scene. I think that they were instrumental in crafting so many things that you're seeing in deathcore nowadays, whether people want to admit it or not, but that's a conversation for another day, which I've already talked about that. Made an entire video on it. Search up the importance of Infant Annihilator. But overall, I think that deathcore is a very complex and just overall nuanced genre to talk about, because you can't really chalk up its success or its downfall to any one thing, because it's gone through so much transformation in its small time. It had to grow up fast in a way, in a time when social media dominated a lot of stuff, when the internet was starting to become more used with things like YouTube and Facebook and MySpace and stuff like that. And so it just found its infancy at a very chaotic time when it was bound to be pushed and pulled in every which direction, and I think it got very close to just dying entirely in terms of just closing itself out from people that weren't already down the rabbit hole. Because I'm gonna be honest, in the 2010s, there was a period of time where the people that were talking about new material from Chelsea Grin or Suicide Silence or Whitechapel or Thy Art Is Murder, they were people that were already very entrenched in the canon of those bands. I rarely heard people getting into them that were just like, hey, I listened to my first Thy Art Is Murder track today. Did they exist? Obviously, but not nearly to the degree that other genres enjoy, and especially not to the degree that deathcore is enjoying now. What are your guys' opinions of this topic? What do you think caused the downfall as well as the new rise of deathcore? You can let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear your opinions on this topic. Agree or disagree, there is no wrong answer. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.